Mary Ellen Carsley is a scientific and botanical illustrator as well as an art educator. A former practicing architect, she has illustrated 8 books and numerous articles for national and international journals. Welcome, Mary Ellen.
Hello and welcome to my studio. It's great to be here today, and I want to remind you that our time together, we have 90 minutes, and this is an intermediate workshop. So we're going to be moving a little more quickly than those of you who have been with me in the past might be used to. So what I'm going to encourage you is, since our time together is short, during this introduction and orientation time, I encourage you to prepare your space, to make sure that you have all of your supplies at the ready, including a little container of water, as well as maybe some napkins and paper towel, and of course the things that are on the list of supplies that were sent to you and that are also on my website. What we're going to do today is we're going to begin with those fundamentals, with those structures. And I'm going to switch the camera now so that you're going to be able to see exactly what is on my drawing board. So what I have here, okay, is, and this is actually in your class notes, what I have here is our zinnia flower, which is what we're going to be focusing on our painting in the second half of this workshop. Structurally, some things that I want to point out to you about the zinnia is that what's really important to remember is to notice when we draw, the first thing we should be looking for are these axes of symmetry. So we notice that the flower is symmetrical about a vertical axis as well as a horizontal axis. We also notice that the flower is made up of concentric circles. So this information helps us greatly when we're drawing, because we begin to understand how the smaller parts relate to the larger parts. And also we have an opportunity to see how the parts relate to each other proportionally. So when we look at the center of the flower, if we don't need to worry about if this is an inch or an inch and a half. We measure, when we draw, we measure how the different parts relate to each other proportionally. So you're measuring the flower against itself. So if I take the center of the flower and I compare that center measurement to the diameter, I notice that the center of the flower, this diameter, it's about 3/4 of that diameter will give me the relationship of where the length of the petals. So this way we're able to draw the flower itself. So let's go ahead and start that. I'm going to have a blank piece of paper here, and I'm going to just start how I would draw part of this flower. So I would begin with and I'm going to be drawing with a 4B pencil. I encourage you to use a 2H pencil. The reason is that the 4B pencil, I'm drawing with that today because it's a much, much darker line. But when you're drawing for yourself, especially for an underdrawing, you should use a 2H pencil. Always remember H for hard. That means the lead is harder. And that for the same amount of pressure, it makes a lighter line. Whereas the 4B is, I like to think of it as bolder. And this is where you find the indication of that, is on the end of the pencil. That bolder line can be seen better by the camera for our purposes today. So you may wonder, how am I going to draw a circle without a circle template? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw 2 lines here. Drawing straight lines, extend the pencil and run the heel of your hand down the edge of the paper, and then you're able to draw a perfectly straight line. Find the center, trust your eyesight, and then simply do the same thing. in order to draw a horizontal line. I want to make sure that I draw my center of my flower. I could actually measure that if I have the flower in person. And now I have 4 points, and I can simply draw 4 identical arcs. Remember, there's no rule about you have to keep your paper in the same place. That I'm going to use today, since I'm going to be doing watercolor, I'm going to be using a white plastic eraser, because that tends to be a little more gentle on the tooth of the paper. Okay, so I have a basic circle here. I can tweak it. And then what I'm going to do is I'll recall that about 3/4 of this dimension, right? When we looked at our flower over here and we measured that, about 3/4 of it gave us that perimeter. And then I can take that dimension, bring it out here to the edge. I think that's a little further in. And now I have my outer circle here. Now, because this is symmetrical, okay, and actually we really only need to draw 1/4 of this, but we'll draw half of it for today. You'll see what I mean in a moment. Most of you have probably guessed it, because you're all flower and garden aficionados, and everybody enjoys looking at flowers. You can probably have noticed these relationships yourself. And as I said, I want to remind you, these construction lines are much darker than I would normally make them for myself. So there we go. Now I have the relationship of parts that I want. The smaller florets actually exist in this area in here, this area here. Okay. And then what I notice is I start to notice the number of petals. Now, typically, zinnias are based on they have 6, 12 to 24. So what I'm going to do is, and I do notice that with the zinnia flower, I very seldom have a petal that's right on the line of symmetry. It's a little bit over to the side. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to box in. I'm going to try to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There we go. And I have some, and I'm going to put in these 3 larger petals like this. And then notice that on the underneath, there are other petals. Now, very, very cartoony flower, very basic, but that's okay, because this is how we get started. Because we can add the details and the personality and the individuality of the flower as we go on. And then I also notice that there's 4 to 6 small florets on each end there. So I have the basic bit of the flower. Now, when you encounter a brand new flower, one of the things that I would encourage you to do is to get a piece of scrap paper and do a quick sketch like this. Now, also too, I mentioned this will help you understand the structure of the flower. Now, speaking of the structure, we have to look at it in more than one more than one view. So we're looking at this here in this example as a top view of it, as if the flower were almost flat. And as I mentioned, I noticed that in my observations, I noticed that the petals alternate top, under, and so on. So when I look at that, I'm going to notice that if I were to take the flower, and this is as if we could take the flower and cut it away, cut it completely in half. Now, I know it seems sad, but if you do have an X-Acto knife, it is really fascinating to cut flowers in half and to notice how their structure works. And you can very, very clearly see where one petal is on top of the other petal as it goes around. Also, too, notice the shape of the center of the flower and where the petals are compared to the flower center. In the zinnia, it has this pyramid shaped center to it, and the florets are actually around the side of that, and then eventually as the flower matures, they begin to come out more up on the top. So by observation, we look for those lines, those axial lines for symmetry. We look for those proportions of the relationship of parts. And then we also look for how those parts relate to each other in different points of view. Now, if we were going to take this flower and we wanted to reproduce this so that we could put it on watercolor paper, we could actually do, and this is, again, this is mentioned on my website. I could take a thin piece of paper. This is just standard tracing paper. I also find that if I'm drawing dark enough, that my that regular computer bond paper, just standard computer bond paper, works well. You can do the same thing with this. And what I can do is, this is just my rough draft. And I can use this tracing paper to create an underdrawing for myself. And by simply folding it on that axis, this is one of those secret pro tips. So you're an insider now. You're an insider. And I like to take the end of a plastic ruler and just apply some pressure to it. You're going to notice, and I'll take the white piece of paper so you can see it, you have a ghost here. And then all I have to do is trace over that ghost again. And again, this is a, oops, these I got a little enthusiastic there. I think I made those a little long. Let me fix that. And now I have half my flower. And this is a classic kind of almost elementary school. You might have even done this in elementary school or middle school. But it's a great way to get the basics of the flower. And now we have a ghost again. And I can, if I trace this with my pencil, again, so I can see it, then I could take the entire flower and put this onto any kind of paper I would like. I could put this onto a fine drawing paper that might be a little bit delicate, that I'm nervous about, having a lot of erasure marks on. I can put this on watercolor paper. And now I can also make adjustments. If it seems to me that, I can get this onto my watercolor paper, trace this on to there. I can rub it on. Now that it's onto that paper, just simply rub it onto there. And now I have just the very, very lightest of ghosts on there, but that's okay. I'm going to come in with my pencil, and this would be the opportunity now where I would check the number of my petals. I would also start to look for those wonderful little details that make each flower unique and beautiful. And maybe I'm even going to and then I could go around and change that. As I said, put in these softer areas with the little florets. And I would have my zinnia flower ready to paint. So we're going to set this one aside for a moment. And let's look at our pollinators, because as we do this, let me bring the camera down just a bit so you can see that. And if there's any additional marks that we don't want for right now, we can take those out. I don't think I want to have those crosshair lines in and things like that. And our flower is ready to paint, or we can begin to put in the values. Now, as a bit of a review, remember, if we imagine that our light source is coming from that upper left-hand corner. Now, and I remind you, if you are a right-handed person, you want to make sure that your light source is coming from the upper left-hand corner. You're going to find that it's easier to manipulate your shadows that way. And you're going to imagine a simple light source, a singular light source. And then those of you who are lefties, the special people, the same hand of Michelangelo, you should be very, very happy about that. Those of you who are lefties, you want to have your light source coming from the right. You're going to find that it's easier to manipulate your shadows that way. Now, you're going to notice that I am drawing with knowledge at this point, right? Because I know that I have this disc of petals, these florets that are above the petals, so they're going to be casting a little shadow, and that I also have that conical but kind of pyramidal shape here of that center of the flower. So it's going to be darker down here at the bottom, and it's going to get lighter as I get to the top. Also, the zinnia has that classic sort of textured center. And remember, we have a few pictures of the zinnia on our website, on the website, so you can see here all of that texture that I'm trying to capture in my drawing. And notice that when I'm putting in my values, I'm actually using the side of my pencil a good bit. Now, I'm going to, there's a little indentation in that zinnia petal. It's kind of classic. So I'm going to go, and I'm definitely going to put that in. Notice I'm spending a lot of time on the shadow side of the flower. And notice how it's already starting to pop, because I'm putting in these cast shadows, and that lovely little ever so gentle dip that the petals take, meeting up with the center of the flower, and we start to have that lovely roundness. Then I'm putting in the same on the other side. With your drawing, try not to fall in love with tiny details until you have all of the big gestures, the big shapes of the shadows. Notice I spent a lot of time getting that crescent shadow that's on the back side of that. Because if you get confused about shadows, take a moment, draw a little sphere for yourself. Remember, put your little arrow there. That's where my light is coming from. I'm going to have a, part of my sphere is going to be in shadow here, like this. Okay, and it's also going to cast a shadow. It's going to be slightly elongated, generally because our light is coming in at an angle rather than straight from above, which would be like a noontime situation. Cast shadows are always darkest closer to the object, and then they fade as they get further away, and their edges are quite soft. It's only extraordinary lighting situations that make for a hard cast shadow. But what's really important is to come back in with your eraser and pull out that reflected light. That's going to be, there's something always counterintuitive to remember about light, is that we think that the part of the surface that is the furthest away from the object is going to be the darkest. And that in fact is not the case, because what's happening is light is bouncing off of the surface that the object, that is the ground plane or the surface that the object is sitting on. And it's actually bouncing off of it and bouncing back on to that back surface. And what happens is the darkest part of the shadow ends up being the area where the surface is turning away from the light. So it ends up being more in the middle of the shadow rather than at the furthest edge away from the light source. So when you get confused, stop yourself, draw a little sphere, remind yourself how basic lighting works, and then you can go back to your object. And I'm probably even going to come in here, put in a little bit of a turning shadow here. Oh, I like that. And I'm gonna do what I call, every artist calls it something different. I'm gonna knock down some of this, in the sense that, and what I mean by that is I'm making this a little bit darker over here, because I want pretty much everything on this side of the flower to be a little bit, because this is all the shadow part, and we're going to pick up some highlights up here, but I want this part to be significantly darker than the lighted side of the flower. And you can see, again, we're starting to get that sense of movement as well. Now, if you're wondering what I'm using here, another pro tip, something that's super inexpensive that you can buy, it's called a stump. If you're not familiar with this, it's simply, and I'll hold it up to the camera closely so you can see it. It is simply a rolled piece of paper. You could clean it by rubbing it on some sandpaper, but also it's handy to keep around some dirty stumps, because they actually end up, as you can see, being a bit of a drawing tool. You can get a light value with them, and they can be quite handy that way. The reason I'm using a stump today is because the stump does the blending that I could do with my fingers. But if I'm thinking about watercoloring this, I want to avoid doing any kind of blending with my fingers. You have natural oils on your fingers, and as we know, oil and water does not mix. And so you do not want to get a lot of your own natural oils onto the drawing surface if you can help it. If you're planning on doing watercolor, because you actually can, and I've done this many times myself, so you actually can make little skip areas where the watercolor simply will bead through. You could sometimes pull it out with an eraser, but again, you run the risk of sort of tiring the surface or the tooth of your paper. So you really want to be a little more conscientious about what you're doing. And again, I do want to remind you, I am drawing with a 4B pencil. And again, if I were doing this for myself, I would be drawing with a 2H pencil. The reason being that there's going to be a lot of loose graphite now on here, because in the B pencils, part of what makes them lighter is the fact that there is much less binder keeping and there's also less clay in the actual drawing material. So pencils are composed of binder, clay, and graphite, and typically those proportions are proprietary for depending on the company that makes the pencils. And so when we have less clay, as we do in a B pencil, and less binder, we're going to have a lot more graphite. That graphite loves to move. It doesn't like to stick to things. And that can be a problem if we're going to be introducing a wet medium to this. So I'm actually going to be painting today on something that has a 2H background, but I wanted to show you how I would do this underdrawing. And this is one way that you can work. If you work, and one of the things I like to emphasize to folks who are drawing, there's really not a wrong way to do art. If it works for you, I mean, there are advisable ways, obviously, because, you know, the materials, you know, you have basic fundamental chemical things like oil and water don't mix, graphite likes to move, those kinds of issues. But if it works for you, you should do it. I'm not a very dogmatic teacher that way, but I do encourage you, if you should study with as many people as you can.
Hey, Mary Ellen. Yeah, I was going to see if we could check in with a couple of questions and a time check.
I would love that.
The first question somebody asked is, do you take a sketchbook with you and do observations in the field? They're saying that they have a habit of using a camera, but wondering if they should start with sketching when they're looking at things like birds, trees, and flowers, things like that.
Oh, that's a great question. So one of the things that, and actually I'll switch back here to my face, and then that way I can look at everybody and answer the question, and that'll give folks a chance to catch up a little bit. So I use a combination. Yes, I carry a sketchbook with me all the time, and I'm constantly, if I'm waiting in line, I try to sketch. If or you're waiting to pick somebody up from public transportation, great time to sketch. Sketch all the time, as much as you can. But with, in the sort of my life journey, I want all the money back that I spent developing pictures of subjects that I wanted to take, when now we have the cell phone and you can take pictures. So what I typically do is I typically take a picture first, then I start sketching. Assuming that I'm not going to have enough time to finish that sketch, then I can always go back to it at another time, or I have a terrific reference picture. So yes, draw from life as much as you possibly can. One of the problems with photographs is that they automatically flatten it for you. And so that's why it's so important to draw from life, to do these kind of structural drawings where you're sort of taking it apart. And then that way you can draw in a way that's much more natural, much more realistic. So I hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to my drawing now. Hopefully that gave folks a chance to catch up and looking at things, because I know in these classes you're just like, oh my gosh, she's drawing so fast, and And but don't worry, everything I draw too, I will put on my website, so you'll be able to see the actual drawings, not only the ones, the reference drawings like this one that I've been referring to, but also the things that I actually did in class. So you don't need to worry about that. Now, so here's our zinnia, and I have to say, at this point, one of the things I would do is I would come in with my eraser. I would probably pull out some of the lines here on the edge of my flower, particularly if I was going to keep this as a drawing and not as a base for a watercolor. And come in and put in some of these things, and I would let the value tell the story rather than the line. You know, lines can be lines can be a little bit, when you use your lines, consider, especially at this point, those of you who are feeling a little bit like, I've done the basic classes and I feel like I'm ready for that next step. One of those next step moves that's really important is something called lost and found line. And this is where you're going to notice, like, the line disappears in here. And then you can see that line again. So I'm purposefully creating a rhythm of darks and lights by having this lost and found line. This is much more interesting to the human eye. It's a little bit like, it's kind of like, I'm trying to think of, I'm a big movie buff. And one of the things that I've always loved about particularly French movies is that they have a subtlety to them, and they sort of assume that you're watching very, very closely. And, sometimes so much is said in a look and a gesture, and it doesn't need someone to say the lines. It can be, you can be a little bit like when a movie sort of tells you everything and it's very, very talky. You're like, okay, I get it. This is like that. You want to have that sort of subtlety. There's movies that are quiet movies, but very, I think about movies like Remains of the Day with Anthony Hopkins is a well-known, very subtle, and you have a sense of his life and who he is, but he doesn't talk too much. He doesn't say too many lines. And like poetry is the same thing. You want that careful choice. And then you get a much more subtle effect with the flower or whatever the subject is that you're drawing. I'm going to put a little bit of shadow here, just on this side to indicate, and at this point, I'm just indicating texture. And you'll notice that in the florets, I'm putting just a little part to indicate that center of the floret. And I'm coming in now with a sharp point to my pencil to get that little point of dark value, this little contrast, this really help create the whole form. And we get a sense of the subtlety of that form. Now remember, in your drawings, you always want to have your darkest dark, but you want to be able to create that whole value range all the way down to that ever so subtle gray. Here's the value scale. I'll do a quick recap for folks. So here's our value scale, okay? And we've got that. And then, and as I was mentioning, you want to have pretty much everything in that value scale in your drawing. And then you want to make those little sparkles are going to be that point of contrast where you have something very dark next to something very light. And that's what really makes the sparkle with it. So that's our fundamental drawing for our zinnia. And now what I'm going to do, and I don't want you to go into a flat out panic, okay? Like I said, remember, I'm going to have all of these posted for you. You're going to be able to see all of them. This one's already up on my website for you. But what I'd like to do is I want to talk about some of our pollinators, because so many times we get accustomed, we feel safe drawing a particular subject. But I want to go on to one of our pollinators, and I'm going to go on to the bee, because I want you to see that these same skills can be applied, okay, to exactly to any subject that you'd like. Okay, so we have our bee here, and what I'm going to do is, you're going to see, I'm going to draw the bee. I'm going to approach this in exactly the same way, okay, as I did the zinnia. So we look at the bee, we see that it has a vertical axis of symmetry. Fantastic. Let's get that line down. Now I have that central axis for our bee, okay? I can even use, I have my reference drawing there, but I also have, I have photographs of the bee, okay? So, and I'm going to be doing the worker bee. And so one of the things I want you to notice about, and we'll use the photograph because we'll use the real bee here. I want you to notice the big basic shapes when we're drawing that. That's always what you want to notice. We've got basically a circle here. We've got an oval here, and we've got an oval here at the top. And when we look at those relationships of parts, notice that if we take the head and the excuse me, and the thorax of the bee, so we have the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. That's typical for most insects. And so when we take the head and the thorax together, because the head's extraordinarily small, we look at this, and the abdomen is it's a little shorter, okay, but it's about 1 3/4 of this dimension, okay? So let's look at my sketch here that I have, where I have that all sort of, but you can see here, I even have the dimension lines, and there, and we've got just about 1/4 left. So let's put that in. So how would I get this started? I would take my bee, and I'm going to actually draw the thorax and the head first as an oval. And I'm using that center axis slightly differently this time, because I'm centering everything up on that. And then I need to add about 1/4 left. And then I'm going to add this part. Now, bees tend to taper just a tad towards the back. So I'm going to add that in. And you can see that we've reduced this, when you look at this, it's really typical to be like, oh my goodness, where would I get started? All those little bits and pieces and parts. But if we just reduce it down to those big shapes, then it's much, much easier to draw. Now, if I were when I do scientific illustration, this type of drawing would be called a holotype drawing, okay, and it would be an overview. So this means that it's actually drawn more for identification, and you're going to see how I'm starting to alter the drawing. I started with those big shapes, but there's a little more subtlety to it, and I'm starting to put those subtleties in. Okay, so we don't usually see insects in this position, okay, this flat position. So again, this is kind of one of our fun study drawings, that we can do in order to help us draw with more knowledge and therefore more convincingly and realistically. Sometimes you see the stinger, sometimes you don't. Best if you don't. And you can see now I have a lot of this. I think I was a little enthusiastic on the eye. Need to bring that down. And don't be intimidated by insect legs. They are really, like, draw them very geometrically. The forelegs, and they always have like a little triangle at the end. It's called the tarsi. And you'll notice that the foreleg is attached to the thorax here, and then the back legs are in fact attached to the abdomen. So these are all the things that, you know, we learn just by doing a simple quick sketch. And again, this does not have to be a work of art. This is just a sketch that you can do in your sketchbook. I think I made that too long, so I'm going to correct that. And, you know, then you're ready to go. Now, the wings, okay, are attached to the thorax. And when I put them in, I'm going to put them in as a basic shape. It's going to be a kind of basic triangular shape. And I encourage you to avoid wanting to round things off right from the start. You don't want to do that because this will help you get all those proportional relationships that you need to get. And now what I'm going to do is our trick that we did before, where I just take, this is my scrap paper. If it's a page in your sketchbook, that's fine. You can fold it. You know, just make sure you draw it in such a way that you can easily fold the page. Okay, I've got that. And just like the flower, I'm going to come on in and I'm going to darken down some of the details that I have here. I can work out any sort of things that don't seem to be working if I put these in. But again, if I'm using this as an underdrawing for a watercolor, I am not going to waste my time on lots and lots of detail. This is really, oops, not watching what I'm doing. This is really just the skeletal structure that I'm going to use. And then I'm going to spend lots of time putting all of my details and things onto, you know, I can rub that onto here. And from here, I can do all of the details with the bee that I would like to do. You could barely see that. I can see it a little bit better than you. So I'm going to just darken that down real quick. You can see that having that there allows me to put in all of those details on the bee. Now, I'm going to leave our bee behind for right now because the pollinator that we're going to be focusing on, okay, the main thing I want to just point out with the bee is, again, you know, when you think about with the bee, and we have that structure, that basic structure, you can see how, and I created this drawing exactly the same way that I just showed you, this one over here, using the same method where we had that. And then you can see where I took that very, very, the very geometric kind of wing, soften it down, make all of those details. And remember, this body is very rounded and things. So I need to remember when I'm putting in all of my shadows, okay, that how those basic shadows work. So don't be intimidated by these by these seemingly complex bodies. Take them apart by looking at those big shapes. So we went from looking at our flower, which has these big basic concentric circles, and then these tiny flowers inside, but they're all based on a circle as well, okay? And then we take circles and ovals or eggs, and we can make our bee and work with it that way. And remember, we're always measuring against itself, find some part of the body to measure the larger parts of the body against, okay? And that will help you draw anything. This is the way you would start to draw people, is the same way. Now here's our butterfly. And this is going to be our, one of our feature butterflies. But remember, we're going to be drawing the butterfly. We're actually going to be looking at it with its wings up. And one of the things that I learned from the butterfly when I did my drawing like this, it has the very tiny head, the thorax, and the abdomen at the bottom here. So that 3-part body again. But in the butterfly, of course, the wings are the major feature. The wings do connect to the thorax. And you'll notice that this one kind of comes up the hind wing here. The forewing is slightly on top in this view to the hind wing. That's going to be important because in our picture that we're going to be using as our base, you're going to notice that hind wing here, okay, is in front of the forewing. So by studying the structure, this becomes a very understandable circumstance. I'm going to encourage folks to get out their underdrawing here. And this is my underdrawing. Hopefully it's not too light, okay? But this is my underdrawing from my from the photograph that we had there. Okay, and I did this in the same way as we just discussed. I actually did a tracing of it and did that underdrawing. I would also draw this from life or draw this from one of my own photographs, so there's a number of ways that you can get this image on, and I'm going to pull way out so you can see what I'm doing on my page, on my paper here. I've got my photograph here. You're going to notice that I have some blue painter's tape. Okay. One thing about art supplies is you don't have to pay an arm and a leg necessarily for everything. Only the things that you really want to. Painter's tape. They sell it as artist tape, sometimes art supply stores. If you go to your local hardware store or local DIY store, you can find inexpensive blue painter's tape, and it works perfectly for doing watercolor. Now, when we do watercolor, we always work with our page. Once we have our drawing on it, we always work with our page taped down, or if we're working in a watercolor block where it's already attached to the block on the sides. We do this because we're going to be introducing water onto the paper, and we want to keep it, and I'm going to zoom down now. We want to keep it from buckling. We don't want the paper to start to get little hills and valleys in it. So we tape it down or work on a watercolor block for that reason. And that will help us, that will help make sure that our pigment goes where we want it to. Because if it has hills and valleys, the pigment is going to start to roll into the little dips. And we may not want a dark value there. That might not be what we want at all. So we want to make sure that our page stays nice and flat while we're working on it. And we keep it taped down until it's completely dry. I usually try to give it until overnight. So as I mentioned, we're going to make sure you have a little bit of water, okay? And I'm going to zoom up so you can see my setup a little bit here. I'm going to keep my block handy. It's going to be, or my watercolor palette handy. I'm going to move my pencils and things to the side for now. And I also like to keep in between and I'll move my camera a little. There you go. I like to keep my dinner napkins or paper towel right here. And by dinner napkins, I mean paper ones. These are kind of the ones that are the fancy dinner napkins that you find in the grocery store. They make a great blotter for your brush. I have several brushes right now. I'm probably going to be painting primarily with a number 4. That's the one, or a number 3. That's these two brushes here. They're both rounds, and they're called rounds because the actual bristles are arranged. If you look at them from above, right, they're arranged in a round way. This is a flat. I like the flat occasionally to use for a wash. But most of this painting, I'm going to be using the 3 and the 4 round. Now, a little bit of a pro tip. I'm going to set that flat aside. A little bit of a pro tip about brushes, and I'll bring the brush up closer to the camera here. One of the things that indicates a good brush is that once we get it wet, you'll notice that it has a very, very nice tip on it. It should not have any stray hairs or any kind of splaying at the end. It should come down to a nice tip, and that's really what you want for your watercolor brushes. If you go to buy watercolor brushes in the art supply store, I highly recommend that you bring a little container of water so that you can, because brushes will all look perfect in the art supply store because they come with a little bit of starch in them, and you need to rinse that starch out to make sure that the brush is in fact a good brush. Watercolor brushes can be, anywhere from $10 to $50. And if you're going to be spending that kind of money, you should be able to check the brush. So make sure that you do check it before you buy it. And then that way, you know that you're making a really good investment in your brushes. Now, we were talking earlier about structural studies, but also and I'm going to bring this down, okay, so you can see it. Another study that is truly helpful is doing a completely monochromatic study. Now, in monochrome, that refers to mono being one, chrome meaning color. So it is a one color study. And this helps you understand the relationship between not only how the light is working on your subject, because sometimes we look at photographs, they're so brightly lit, and especially if we took the picture in full sunshine and things like that, it's really hard for us to start to notice, like, oh, well, this petal's in shadow, that's in shadow, there's a little bit of shadow here, there's a lot of lightness here. That if we take the time to do a shadow study of it, we really, this can really be advantageous to us. Also, when we talk about underdrawings, this can also act as an underpainting, and it's a huge advantage to paint like this, because the watercolor is transparent. And so the values, I could actually add color to the top of this painting and have a full color painting with all of my values already there, set and ready to go. And we'll talk about how we do that. Now, in order to create this is a shadow, what's called a shadow mix. And for those of you who are curious where I learned this from an amazing painter. He was, for many, many years, he was the head illustrator at the Missouri Botanic Gardens. His name is Keith West. He has passed away, but he wrote a wonderful book that I do mention on my website. It's a little hard to find now because I believe it's out of print, but it's called Drawing and Painting Wildflowers. And he is, one of the things that I really enjoy about Mr. West is that sometimes some artists are not willing to share about how they get certain effects or what kind of techniques they use. They keep that as kind of a personal trade secret, and that's a choice that you certainly can make as a professional. But as an art educator, I really feel compelled to share these kinds of things. So I was always admired the fact that he talked about what his shadow mix was. And what it is it's taking ultramarine. Let me make sure I have my French ultramarine. Okay, so this is French ultramarine. All right, so you take this, and what you do with the French ultramarine, you mix it with alizarin crimson. It's going to give you a kind of purple. Okay, so very, very, you want to keep it on the cooler purple side. It's kind of vibrant. Okay, so I want you to keep in mind with color theory what we just did. Okay, we just mixed a cool with a warm. All right, and now what we need to do is we need to take away a little bit of that vibrancy in there. And what we can do is we can add just a touch of burnt umber. And that umber, you can see, really neutralizes it. And it makes it a very, very neutral color. And this is the shadow mix that we use, that I use. And so what I'm going to do is, as I mentioned, since I'm going to be putting this on, so you're going to use, I'm going to write this down. So this is French ultramarine. Okay. And then you're going to mix equal parts, okay, of alizarin. And you will notice I'm carefully checking my spelling. I don't know why alizarin gets me every time. Alizarin crimson. Okay. And then you're going to take a burnt umber, which is a cool brown. But that seems kind of an oxymoron, doesn't it? Because browns are usually like a warmer color. But again, it's that aspect of the balance of warm and cool that give us this shadow mix. Okay, now generally the rule of thumb is that if we want the shadow of a color, okay, or the darker value of a color, okay, we're going to take, so for example, we'll take, if we want to have, we have to remember our color wheel, right? So we want to have a darker orange. We actually take a little bit of, because blue is on the opposite of the color wheel, we actually mix in a little bit of blue, and therefore we get those darker values of the orange. And then, of course, in watercolor, we add white by adding more water, and that thins the pigment, allowing the white of the paper to show through. So in this case, okay, so this is our just a review of our basic color theory, okay? We have our hue, the pure hue in the center, Okay, we have the hue plus its complement or opposite on the color wheel. Okay, and here to have the lighter values, okay, we have the hue plus white, or in our case, the water. Okay, so this is going to be going darker, and this is going to be lighter. In value, it's all orange. Okay, so that's our basic color theory in the watercolor. Okay, so we're gonna keep that in mind. So we've got color theory here, we've got our shadow mix up here, and we're ready to go. Okay, now before we get well, we're almost ready to go. Just some quick reminders about watercolor technique. Okay, now with our technique, we want to keep in mind, and I'll keep this little guy handy too. Okay, so we have this here, and I can do some examples as well onto the paper. So with watercolor, we can do several, and I'm going to use some different colors here. With watercolor, I'm going to paint a yellow hue here. I'm going to paint a little bit here as well. And one of the things we can do is we can paint what's called wet into wet. So this is very wet right now. And if I paint the green next to it, I'm going to allow that yellow to bleed into that. And as you can imagine, if we're doing things like flower petals, and my daylilies are about to bust, and I'm so excited about it. If I have a daylily petal, and you'll see how I'm getting that variation, I'm also using, it's the concentration of water and pigment, as well as pressure, and also the posture with the brush. So let me do that again. So if I take this and I want to draw a daylily petal, notice how the brush changes. If I want to go in and get a lighter value, I can lift that out with a clean brush. Okay, I can even go back into that and do that right here on this one. Oh, messed up the tip a little. Nice thing about watercolor is it's pretty forgiving. Some pigments are less forgiving than others. And then if I want to get a bleed, so I want this, while this is wet, I can come in and I can add some cadmium red to get that really deep orange, and maybe even bring a tad of it up here to get that. Sometimes you have like those little streaks through there, and just let it bloom and it ends up having a very natural look to it. Okay, now if I don't want that to happen, for example, in the stripes that exist on the bee, okay, I will definitely want to wait just a little bit, okay, and then very, very carefully put the desired color next to the other color, so I have a distinctive barrier between the two. So remember also, you want to keep in mind that you tend to work with lighter colors and then put the darker colors in later with watercolor, and that way you can preserve any kind of borders that you want to do. So there's a little bit of technique for you. Okay, and so now we're ready to get started. So hopefully most of you or all of you have your underdrawing ready to go, and let's get started with our zinnia. Now for this case, I am not going to draw. Now, I mentioned you could do this. You could paint the whole thing in the shadow mix and paint on top of this. But for our purposes today, I'm going to paint in the way that I would paint if I were sitting in my garden and I'm looking at my I'm looking at my flowers, and I really, really want to capture that moment. I'm going to paint just like I said, just as if I was sitting in my garden on my little camp stool, and I'm going to try to capture the value and the hues all at the same time. So I'm going to be doing a lot of wet into wet painting in this case. Here, I would wait till this painting was completely dry, and then I would put the hues on top of it. This technique I would use more, I think of, for myself, I think of this as being more of a studio technique. So this is something that I would have taken multiple reference photographs. I would also have multiple field sketches for this. Then I would compose it very carefully in a light pencil on watercolor paper, and I would do the shadow study, and then I would let this dry, and then I would go in and put all the hues on top of it. So this would not lend itself, this technique for me does not lend itself to field sketching, but working this way with a quick sketch that I might do in my garden, then this is how I would work. And I would have a piece of scrap paper that is the exact same kind of watercolor paper. And what I usually do is I take one piece of watercolor paper and I, because watercolor paper can be quite expensive. So I take one piece and use it as a sacrifice piece, and I cut it up into smaller pieces so that I'm able to test my colors on the paper. It's really important that it's the same paper, because we don't want you don't want to have the situation where the pigment behaves differently on a different paper sometimes. So you want to be careful about that.
Hey, Marianne, we have one more question too, and I'll give you a 15-minute warning left in the session.
Okay.
Another person is asking, do you ever use any other types of paints for this type of subject?
Oh, well, you could do a variety of different kinds of paints, like acrylic or oil painting. I also do oil painting. But the techniques with those are very specific to those media, and so that would be another workshop, another day. And also what really lends itself to botanical subjects, and it's very, very popular. It was very popular, actually. Andrew Wyeth and his circle. There is a wonderful painter named Folly Weymouth. If you look him up, did incredible botanicals in egg tempera, which, to be perfectly honest with you, I'm saving for when I retire to kind of conquer. I know it's supposed to be a fussy medium from what I understand, but it's a media that lends itself to a lot of detail, which is really exciting. So that, again, another subject for another day, but a lot of botanical artists I know are very, very fond of using egg tempera. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so now what I'm doing here is I am getting ready to paint my zinnia, to paint my my zinnia, and I'm using a quincunxidine. You've got to love that. Say that 5 times really fast. Quincunxidine red. You'll notice that pigments are always named after their mineral, typically, and I'm also taking in some. I meant to use. That was my bad. I'm going to need to wipe that off of my palette. I want to use the quincunxidine red. I don't want to lead you wrong. And I'm going to use a little French ultramarine. And that's going to be our darker value there. And I'm setting up a good amount of pigment on my palette so I can kind of dip quickly. Oh, I'm loving that. Let me look at my photograph. Okay, that's a little bit dark. Let me see. Oh, that's going to be my lighter color. And you want to keep your colors as simple as possible. Really, if you're mixing more than 3 colors, you're doing too much, in my humble opinion. You're making it harder than it has to be. So really try to find the simplest blend of colors. And now we're going to go ahead and get started. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by painting the petals, and you'll notice that I'm leaving the concentration of pigment in the center of the flower. So I'm manipulating the values already as I put the hue on, and I'm going to do a little lifting here so I can get those darks and lights right from the start. Okay, so you really start to load the brush. Okay, I'm trying to pull that in so you can see what I'm doing. And you might notice I skipped a petal. I did that on purpose. I wanted to let that dry. And if you're wondering why I emphasize so much how you use the brush, it's because of a personal experience that I had. I studied Chinese painting for a year with an absolutely fabulous teacher. And Chinese painting is all about values and the brush. And I found that it truly improved my watercolor skills. I was just simply amazed. I kind of like amazed myself when I went back to watercolor after I had been doing Chinese painting. And I realized that I was painting in a completely different way. And you're noticing that I'm occasionally skipping a petal. And the reason is because I do want to keep a little bit of a, I don't want them to completely bloom together. I want you to be able to see that the petals are, individual petals. And then you'll notice too that I'm purposefully streaking the paint in some places, and that's so I can get those little folds of the petal itself. Now, while this is wet, especially as I get into this darker area here, I'm going to come in and I'm going to touch a little bit of it with that darker value. I'm going to add some straight water just so I get a little bit of a bleed and a blooming going on up into the petal. Maybe this one has a little fold going on, so I'm actually going to extend that with the tip of my brush a bit. And then I'm going to bring this down here. And again, bring that there. And I'll bring this down so you can see the different effects that I'm getting. I'm actually going to add even a little bit of that darker value in here as well. So you can start to see now those petals are going down towards the center of the flower. And this one, yes.
Somebody was asking, would you repeat the color you're using besides the red?
Oh, yes. I'm using this. That is a French ultramarine. So you can't, unfortunately, it's probably one of the more expensive pigments for any paint that you're going to use. But it is it is an absolute must-have. The French ultramarine is not a pure blue. It actually has a bit of alizarin crimson in it, which gives it that wonderfully sort of, it has a purplish blue quality to it. And that is just indispensable when it comes to botanical painting, because it's so often a go-to for a cool value. Now, what I'm doing here, this petal, I'm painting it in portions like this, and then I'm going to soften those edges. And then this part is in the sunlight. So I put in that shadow, pull out some of that, just a little bit, because the sun's touching it. And I'm just going to let that bleed, because this petal's casting a shadow onto that one. I wanted to get that. It's so much fun. It's like you get to just, I don't know, you know, it's sometimes when I paint, I think to myself, I think like, it's almost like, you know, you're having the creator sort of like whisper to you, like, look, I designed that wonderful little petal. I did that. I'm so glad you saw it. There's something so wonderful about that nature gives us this. And when you draw and paint, it's just you're privy to this wonderful world that, oh, we're just so busy all the time. Busy, busy, busy. And we miss out on it too often. And you know, it's really the world that, you know, children occupy. They see all the little things, all the little details and things. And this is an opportunity to just free your mind of all those worries of the day, all those things. And, you know, we think we're so important, and all these miracles are going on without us. Flowers are blooming. Bees are making honey. Butterflies are perpetuating botanical life by pollinating. And, you know, and it's going on without us. They don't need us. And there's something, I don't know, I find that all sort of strangely reassuring. Okay, so you can see how we would proceed with the petals. I'm going to let them dry because I know our time together is kind of short, and I'm going to show you how I would proceed with our butterfly. Now, I had the butterfly example here with the wing finished. If you saw my desk, it's such a mess. I'm so sorry. Here we go. There it is. Okay, so now a couple of things I want you to notice about our butterfly. This more yellow closer to the body and a deeper orange as it goes away from the body. And then, of course, all these lovely little white spots. Now, when we look at our underwing, oh, look at that. We've got very, very yellow in here. Little yellow up here, and the deep oranges here on the underside. So let's start mixing that up. Now we're going to work with the lighter color first, and this is one of those parts that's going to be a bit of a relief, right? Because I'm going to mix up that bright orange is just going to be, I'm just going to use that pure right from the start. So we're just going to go right in and we're going to paint this. And one thing though that I do want you to keep in mind, little anatomical insider information on butterfly wings. I spent 2 years in an entomology lab illustrating insects. And one of the things that's really, really important is to give your butterflies some real life. What you want to do is I'm going to put the basic color in here. So we have our basic hue. That's our nice deep color. And now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take that hue and I'm going to touch it with a little bit of the French ultramarine. Okay, that's its opposite blue. Notice that I keep the same blue that I'm using in the flower. Okay, really important if you're going to be using, make a decision about that and then stick with the same palette of colors. Okay, and notice that butterflies have some some very, very hefty veins that go on. And those little veins actually cast a shadow. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here. Oop, I'm pulling out a little too much. Going to have to come back in with some orange. And I'm just going to put just a hint of a shadow of that vein. And that's really going to make your butterfly kind of come to life. Okay, we're going to let that dry. That was a cadmium orange, and I used the French ultramarine to darken it. And then what I'm using now is a real favorite of mine. This is a Naples yellow. And now the difference between a Naples yellow and a cadmium yellow, I'm going to put them next to each other. I'm going to lift the camera up a little so you can see. This is the Naples yellow that my brush is in right now. And you're going to notice that this is a true earth tone. When we have a cadmium yellow, which is a lead-based paint, and you don't need to freak out about that. The cadmium is, unless you take to a diet of eating your paints, you don't need to worry about it. And I wouldn't suggest that you do that. But the cadmium is going to give you a more candy color, a more vibrant color, and Naples yellow is really an essential. That earth tone yellow is really an essential for any botanical palette. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix that with my cadmium orange. You're going to notice that comes out to a much more subtle orange. This is the orange. Okay, that's the orange we're getting from that mix of cadmium yellow and, I'm sorry, I said that wrong, of Naples yellow and cadmium orange. You're going to see that's a much more subtle orange, and that's the orange that we're going for the hind wing in here. You're going to see that's really going to give you what you're looking for there. Now, the other thing is if you're sitting there and you're wondering, what am I going to do about all those little white spots? Well, here's the bonus. You're going to do nothing. You're simply going, this is in watercolor. Remember, you leave the white. Okay. And now you'll also notice that I am purposefully kind of making a concentration of the pigment. So there's a little bit of dark to light movement. And it's, in general, moving towards the body of the butterfly, right? Because, and I'm doing this because this is sort of a big picture thing that you want to keep in mind for your painting. Remember, as an artist, you are always, you are controlling how the viewer sees your subject. And you're controlling that. You've invited them into your personal vision, and you're controlling how they look at it by the visual movement you create. And you create visual movement by creating points of contrast and also creating changes in value. So what I'm going to do here, I want people to generally look towards the relationship of the butterfly and the flower. And doing that, I'm going to create this movement of going from light to dark. Every opportunity I kind of get, I'm going to do that. And you probably already are noticing how, like, there's a sense of wanting to look towards the body of the butterfly here. And I'm doing that lifting by, I dip my brush, I clean my brush in the water. I dip it onto, just give a little pat onto the my paper napkin, just to daub a tad of water off. I don't want it to be soppy wet because I want there to be room for the brush to pick up some of the pigment. Remember, it can be both additive and subtractive when you're painting, but just keep in mind it's very, very difficult to get it back to pure white if that's where you're headed. Now, you'll notice that I overshot some of the lines. It doesn't matter. I'm coming in with a very, very dark value later for that. So I'm not going to need to worry about that. And I'm mixing up just a little bit more now for up here. And all those other spots that I've drawn are all whites. So I don't need to worry about that. And we're not going to worry about the body of our butterfly, because that's going to be our darker value. Okay, and you can see we got that nice light to dark movement there. So now our petals have had a chance to dry a little bit. I'm going to continue with the petals, okay? And we're going to go back to, now normally, just so you know, I would have finished all the petals at once and then I would have moved on to my butterfly. I didn't, because I was worried about the time. so don't think me crazy. There was a method to my madness there, but I'm going to go back and I'm going to finish the petals now. These ones I'm going to keep quite light. Matter of fact, I might even make it lighter than that. They're very in the background here. I don't want them to be competing with my butterfly. So I'm going to keep the petal values. And I might even do something, you probably have noticed already that I did this. I'm going to bring this down just a hair so you can see it. There is an ever so tiny little line, white line that I've left right there. And I did that on purpose. I just trying to bring in some light from the background there to really downplay what's behind. You want anything that's in the distance. This is way too intense, but I'm going to take it away. You'll see in a moment. Anything that's in the distance, and I can actually paint over these little parts of the insect's body. That's a larger part, so I'll avoid that because it's going to go in as black or close to black. We'll talk about black in a minute. But anything that's in the distance is going to be a less intense and vibrant hue. It's also going to be a lighter value in general. And that's part of how you get what's called atmospheric perspective. You give the impression that things are further away by making them lighter, both in value and hue and in intensity in the hue. So I'm doing that. You probably noticed I added just a hair of that darker value in there as it approaches the center of the flower, and that's just to keep that turning value going. You know, and also this is going to be creating a nice point of contrast in here, because remember, this is going to be the bright part of the center of the zinnia. I'm also going to pull up just ever so slightly a little bit, just intensify that just a little bit. And then I'm going to lighten this up here and lighten it up here, just so we have that that break between the petals there. Because these lines, a lot of the lines that you see, once the drawing is completely dry, I'll come back in with a white plastic eraser. And just to refresh your memory, that's, you know, what these look like. I'll come back in with a white plastic eraser and I will take out any of the extra pencil lines that remain in the painting. Now this is a case where the petal actually comes up a little bit in front of the wing. Okay, I'm going to take, that's going to be again, just bringing some of that and you'll notice that it's very light back here. I'm starting to get a little more intense because we're coming around towards the front now. And I'm pushing some of that pigment over to make a little bit of an edge. And now I'm going to go ahead and paint. There's some fun things in here that have happened. There's some petals that are all mixed up. I love when flowers get to a point where they look like they shook their little heads and you get all of this wonderful, you know, the petals are all mixed up and it's just so delightful. So I'm going to try to get some of this craziness in here going on.
Mary Ellen, while you're working, we had a question about how often you change your water.
Oh, if that's a great question. If your water is becoming of value and you're noticing it, you know, like when you wash your brush, you're like, oh, my brush already has a color on it, or it already has like a dark tone on it. It's definitely time to change your water. So you do, and that will vary depending on the pigments that you're using. And that's a great segue. I'm really glad somebody asked that question because so I might change my water a couple of times during a painting. Something like this, probably not. I would probably be fine just having one. And this is the size of my. So I have about a pint of water. But no, that's not true. I probably have about 3 pints of water here in this little container. Also, by the way, I'm also really fond of using glass containers just because they clean up thoroughly. Plastic containers often get stained by various pigments. So I really, really like having a glass container. But that being said, I do keep one of these, and I'm gonna, this is one of those things that you want to spend your extra money on that you save. This is like one of those dog bowls, and it's a plastic, you can see it pops open. And this is really handy for field sketching because you can keep it flat and keep it in your purse. So, and you know, or in your backpack or whatever. It's also saved me with my dog a couple of times too. My poor dog, who is mooning outside of the studio door because she cannot participate. Her idea of participation is somewhat distracting. So, and I'm coming over here again. You'll notice like sometimes I let things dry so I can get a definite edge in there. I'm finding that a little, I think that needs to be a little lighter. I love this edge, worked out really nicely. So I'm going to keep that. This is a little muddy in here for me. I might come in and pull out a few things. And this petal down here, I'm going to just get the edge of it here. I'm going to add a little bit of that French ultramarine, but you're going to notice I'm doing a lot of lifting. I want that to be pretty light. It's not as important. Oh, and I just noticed that might have been off the camera there a little, so let me pull that down. It was right here that I was working, pulling this out. I added a little French ultramarine right there just to get that bloom in there. You're going to notice if you can see it. Let me bring this down. You might see those pencil lines there. I gave myself some indication of where there's some darks in here. So I'm going to come in, pull that out, get that turning shadow, and then I will purposefully come back, soften that up with that. And so it's a little more natural looking, just a hair more natural. And I'm going to come in. This is right with the tip of my brush. I'm bringing in some of that French ultramarine because I want a value change here so that I'll bring a little reflected light on the other side, creating a tiny point of contrast so that you can see one petal from the other. And I'm glad that little opportunity was there. That's one of those fun little moments in painting where you can get sort of fiddly and it's a fun kind of fiddly, come in with that little tiny brush, do these little tiny movements with it. I'll pull that out. Now, one thing I have to tell you is I find watercolor, I tell this to my students a lot, to be what I call a hurry up and wait medium. And it seems like you have to kind of move fast, and then you have to give it a chance to dry, or you have to just wait until it's just the right amount of wet so you can go in and do whatever you want to do. So now one thing that I'm noticing that I'm going to bring in a little more of the intense color. I was working a little bit lightly here to balance that out. You get that, you see that's working a little nicer now. And keeping these lighter colors back here. This actually is a little short petal that's showing. So I'm going to intensify that. And now we have this really fun situation. This is the underside of a petal. This petal is foreshortened. So it means foreshortening in perspective means that it's coming right at you. So you're actually seeing it as if it's shorter than it is. It gives you that illusion. So, and also the other thing is this is an opportunity. You notice I put that dark value in, but I'm actually lifting a little right now because petals have a translucent quality and you always have to get a little bit of that glow in there. Matter of fact, I might pull just a bit of that out there. I'm doing a little blotting on that. That's very dry and I want to lift that up. So I'm using my a clean part of my napkin. Yeah, be very careful about that. You can really mess yourself up if you go to do some blotting and you find that you're using kind of a spotty part of your blotting paper there. There we go. Now we got that petal and it's turning. I'm going to make this one a nice This is a little tiny one. I'm gonna lighten that up, create a little contrast there. And then there's just a little bit more in here. One last little petal in there. And now we're going to be onward to, I'm going to let all of these dry, and then we're going to come back and tackle the center of the flower there. But we've got our petals, and the main thing with the petals is that you'll notice we have the much more intense values and colors are right in front of us. And then as it moves away, the values and the intensity of the color reduce so that we have a sense of that roundness and that movement going on. Now, as it dries, you can go in and you can add little spots of darks and lights and things like that, or even after it dries, you can go in and detail more with your brush. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to mix up a new color, okay? And I'm going to make a clean spot on my palette, okay, which isn't something I often do. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix some French ultramarine, and I'm going to mix some burnt umber with it. Okay? And you're going to notice that you get a black, or what is more commonly called a Davy's gray. Okay, you never really need to buy black. Now, black you have to be careful with, buying a pure black, because the pigment that they use for black is typically what they call lamp black, and that actually comes from, they make it from soot. And the problem with it is it's a color killer, because the actual original pigment is black. Now, what I want you to imagine is that I just mixed a French ultramarine. Remember, it has just a touch of the alizarin crimson. So there's cools and there's warms in here. There's all kinds of pigments in here making that black. So this is a much livelier color. Okay, so that's really important to remember when you're painting. So you can make that black. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start using the tip of my brush. And again, I'm going to keep that intense black, right down towards the body of the butterfly. I'm getting just as I did with the other. Now, isn't that amazing? That's blue and brown, remember, and that's black. Okay. Now, what I love about this color is if you add a little more of the French ultramarine, you get the color. What you can buy is called Davy's gray. I mentioned that, and that's a beautiful, beautiful color. I live by the Chesapeake Bay, and in the fall, that blue gray, it's so lovely. It reflects the fall sky. That blue gray is the color of the bay water, and it's just spectacular because there's the French ultramarine in the sky. Down lower, the sky is cobalt. Up at the top, always notice the sky, this big variation in value in the sky. Now you'll notice I'm using the tip of my brush. I'm carefully painting, but I'm also working, again, here's that hurry up and wait. I'm also working pretty quickly because I do not want this to dry streaky. I really want this to be very much, I do want it to be lighter on the end, but I don't want there to be streaks on the, I should say, at the edge of the wings. Oh, this is when I'm painting things like this is when I just say thank you to the person who invented bifocals. Very happy for that magnifier. I think it was Benjamin Franklin, actually. I think I learned that not too long ago. Someone can check that out. But you'll notice I'm not touching those spots. I'm just leaving them. And I don't want you to worry about, and see, notice how right here, this is so much fun. This is an opportunity to talk about color interaction. I want you to notice how some of you have probably already seen it. Right here, you're probably picking up a hint of a purple, just a hint. It's still like if you looked at that color, you'd say, oh, that's black. But you're seeing that hint of a purple, and that's what I'm talking about. That's why you avoid the black pigment if you can, especially in nature subjects, because there's very few things that are just a pure black. Now, notice that I'm letting that lighten up as I get to the edge. That's on purpose. I'm going to keep that just a bit, not nearly as intense as it is down on the other part of the wing there. And you can see we're starting to get that light to dark movement going on.
Hey, Mary Ellen.
Yes.
Just jump in with a time check, about 5 more minutes. And can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Someone was asking about using watercolor paint pens. Do you ever use those? And would you use the same type of technique?
Wow. You know, I have to be honest with you. I have never used watercolor paint pens. And so but you know, I encourage you, go for it. Try it. I mean that why not? I would suspect that when it comes to color blending and doing wet into wet techniques, that would all be the same. But not having used them, I really can't say. But there are so many amazing media out there now. I can't keep up with it all, but the other thing I would be curious about is if they mix as, you know, if they're as water soluble. So, but yeah, I go for it, definitely. Now, I do want to, since we have 5 minutes left, I don't want to leave our middle of our flower unstarted. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mention of the butterfly until, and I'm going to bring this down. You're not going to do that until the very, very end. You're going to wait until that is completely dry, and you're going to come in with the tip of your brush and use that black mixture that we have. Now, I'm going to, now you're going to love where we're going to go with this, okay? Because this is where we start to talk about palette harmony within a painting. And so what we're going to do is I'm actually going to take some of this orange, okay? And I'm going to take our friend over here, the quinconcidine red. I'm going to mix that in, and you're going to notice that that cadmium orange and that quinconcidine red are going to give us the color. There it is. You see that color that we need for the center. Oops, got a little bit, sorry, got a little bit of reflection there. That's going to give us that color that we need for the center of our flower. It needs a little more of the red, okay? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and I'm going to start to put that in. I need to darken it down a bit, and I'm going to do that with our friend French ultramarine. That's going to give us our darker value. Now, and you can see we have about 6 colors now. Oops. got a little over enthusiastic there. That I need to pull out. Okay, there we go. You can see that, you know, now the whole painting is going to have a kind of harmony because all of these pigments are related to each other. Now, we need to be a little careful because this actually breaks up a little bit. And this is where we use that fun wet into wet technique. I'm going to be taking some of the pure orange and I'm going to be touching that because we have the florets and a variety of little stigma that we can see. And I'm going to just let some of that blend and naturally bloom together. And there's going to be a progression. You're probably already noticing it. There's going to be a progression going from, again, that more intense, cooler color all the way up to the top where our colors are going to get vivid and warmer. Now you'll probably be seeing, wow, she's breaking that all up. It's just a bunch of little spots. Well, I'm doing that on purpose because I want to bring some of this orange in, some of that pure cadmium orange. Okay, and this is a case where I'm going to come in, I'm going to shift that orange a little bit, and I'm going to start to shift it. You'll notice it's blending, but this is the cad yellow. So our cad yellow is in the cadmium orange, right? Because orange is composed of yellow and red. But I'm bringing that up to the top of the flower to get those little pollen heads there. And then I will blend that back down. We're going to get a little bit of the undercolor here. It's so much fun when it's wet like that and you get it to maybe add a few little surprises over here. There we go. Okay, now I need to add a little more turning shadow over here. Remember, this is our dark side. So I'm taking that blend of the cadmium orange with the French ultramarine and just touching that in on that dark side. And so let's pull out a little bit. There we go. There we go. I may come back in. Maybe I want to clean up these edges a little. Might make that a little darker in there. And then we'll have time to come back and finish off our butterfly up there. But I think that's probably all the time we have, isn't it, Emily?
That's right, Marianne. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful to watch this take shape.
Oh, that's exciting. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And I do like to mention to everybody that once you've been my student, and those of you who've been with me before, you know this, once you've been my student, I consider you my student for life. So please feel free to reach out to me via email. You can get my email. I think it's in the chat, but it's also on my website. So I love it when people send me pictures of their work. If you want feedback, I'm happy to give you feedback. If you just want me to cheer you on, I'm happy to do that too. So I hope I do hear from you. And thank you so much for joining me in my studio today and inviting me into your home.